Today we're talking to Steve Sabo. He has been doing comedy all across the country for upwards of 32 years. Is that correct?
30, this is my 32nd year. Yes, right now.
And so he's delighted fans everywhere and even outside of the country. So it'll be exciting to hear from him today as we learn about the career of comedy and what kind of people it takes to succeed in this field. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Steve, is because I'm about halfway through your book, but so far I'm really loving it and it's got some great stories. And one thing that interests me is that you straight up kind of say, don't do this. Like if you can succeed in any other field, if there's any other passion you have, maybe do that first.
Yes.
And so doing a podcast where we're exploring the kind of people that it takes to succeed in different industries, it really strikes me as a good person to talk to who's willing to say, like, this isn't for everybody, but you kind of lay out what kind of people will succeed. And even if you're not necessarily that kind of person, the kind of steps you can take to be more prepared to become that kind of person. So what's your take on that? Do you think that anybody could do it, or?
Well, see, here's the thing. The reason I do that, and there's a very particular reason for that, is because I know a lot of comics, a lot of people that have struggled to try to make it in the comedy industry, and they tried it for so long, and 5 years, 10 years, and just been completely miserable their entire lives. And in the moment they stop doing comedy, all of a sudden, they've moved on to something else that actually does make them happy. Comedy is a very different animal. It's not like what other people think it is. People think that you're going to tell jokes for a couple months or a year. They don't really. I don't think they really can picture what goes into it, in advance, because they don't know. They don't see it. They don't see the struggles that go through this type of thing. They don't see the failed relationships that you end up having. They don't see the long nights and the long drives and the awful audiences and the crappy, hotels, and they don't see those kind of things. They don't see the things that are in their future, and they don't see that the times where you're excited and you're booked for a show, and then 2 days before it gets canceled, and you're in the middle of nowhere, and you don't even have enough money in your bank account to get home. You got to call somebody to send you some money so you can put gas in your tank just to get home, or your car breaks down, in the middle of Minot, North Dakota, and you got 1,000 miles to drive to your next gig, and they don't even have the part for your car, and it's 3 days till you can get your part, and you can't afford a hotel, and you can't live in your car because it's up on a lift, and you're essentially homeless now in the middle of nowhere in a town that you don't know. And they don't see that kind of stuff. They see the glamour of being on stage and to 1,000 people and them loving every one of your jokes, and that does happen, but that's like 1% of the job. So I try to tell people in advance, because I've had comedians that I've helped along early on in life, and they said, "What's the best advice you can give?" And I said, if you can be happy doing something else, do that other thing, because that's the thing with comedy. For true comedians, what I think is a true comedian is somebody that cannot be happy unless they're going up on stage. Doesn't have to be your full income, doesn't have to be your full existence. You can just do it on weekends if that's your thing, but you need it in your life. It's something that's, I don't want to call it a drug, but as essential as that is, it's your oxygen, it's your food, it's your sustenance. Without having that bringing into your life, then you just don't feel full. You don't feel whole as a person. And anybody that doesn't need that, they should probably, find some other venue that can make them happy, because it's not a really good job if you have a wife or kids, if you want those things in your life, because you're going to miss a lot of birthdays. You're going to miss a lot of school assemblies and games and stuff like that, because almost everybody works their lives around having the weekends free, and that's when comedians aren't free. So I mean, it's a completely different existence, and it's really tough. So I try to explain to people that, in advance. That's why I started out the book saying that. Know that going into this, you're making a decision to, basically live a very hard and probably, at least for a long time, poor life.
Definitely. I think it's interesting that you compared it to a drug, because in your book you say that you've never touched a drug.
Right.
So it's to me it seems like you've kind of filled that not filled that void, but you've
No, no,
that's become your drug. It's
yeah.
something that it fulfills you in that same kind of way, I guess.
People have addictions. I think it's natural for humans to have some sort of addiction, of something, whether it's an addiction, for alcohol or cigarettes or gambling or travel even, or a thirst for knowledge or whatever it is, video games. People have something that, kind of draws them, that they're essentially, you know, I don't want to say dictates their life, but controls a large part of their life. And for me, comedy is definitely that. There's no question.
So, one thing that I was curious about that I haven't gotten to in your book, if it's in there, did you have any jobs before you started doing comedy? Because I know you started when you were pretty young.
Yeah,
So I was just curious, did you do
yeah,
anything else before that?
I did. I've done a lot of jobs, and I did some jobs when I was first starting off doing comedy. I worked other jobs at the same time. So,
I
and
guess
that's
you did mention in the book that you were serving while you were getting started doing
yeah,
comedy.
and I think that's a really good job for for comedians and something like that, because the hours kind of match up in a lot of ways. But before that, man, what did I do? I worked fast food, of course. I managed a liquor store. I managed a movie theater. I was a nighttime security guard for a little while. While I was in college. I've done a few things.
Do you think that any of that stuff prepared you in any way for your comedy career, or gave you stories for stuff to talk about, or did it kind of just show you that that's not really what you're looking to do for the rest of your life?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because s- some of it, I think the serving definitely helped for sure. Give you perspective on people's lives and that kind of stuff. But the rest of it really did mostly just make me go, this is not something I want to do. I can't sit here and I can't clock in and work a 9 to 5. I can't have a boss yelling at me because of the napkins aren't displayed correctly. I just didn't have that in me to deal with that. It's comedians, as a general rule, most successful ones anyway, are most often going to be the smartest person in the room, and it's hard for somebody, you know, like that to take orders from somebody, who isn't quite as smart as them. You know what I mean? So I think any comedian will absolutely understand what that statement means. It kind of drives you crazy to be on the receiving end of criticism from somebody who's not nearly as smart as you are, doesn't know what they're talking about, and that's tough. Yeah, I just knew the moment. I guess I would say this: when I first started doing comedy, I just wanted to keep doing it. That's what I wanted to do. But about 3 years in, I literally sat down and I said, if I could do this for the rest of my life, I'll be happy. And that's it. I just want to do this. That's all I want to do. As long as I can pay my bills and live, it doesn't even have to be, comfortably. Not. I don't have to be rich or anything like that. I just have to be happy, content, and so far I've been able to do that.
Awesome. Yeah. Another thing in your book that struck me, you said as you were getting started, there wasn't much money, and the commitment to comedy that you had to make left you sometimes get in the hot dogs and stuff that they were throwing out of like 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
And that kind of struck a chord with me, just showing the kind of lifestyle you've got to be willing to do in the times of struggle as you're getting started at the very least.
Yeah.
But with comedy, it's also the kind of thing where I think the COVID pandemic has shown it too, that sometimes shows aren't as prevalent as others. Sometimes you may get every single weekend booked, and other times there may be a little bit of a dry spell. So I
Hmm.
think being able to deal with not having a lot of money or managing your money well is something that you've experienced and have made it through.
Yeah, and I do talk about that in the book as well. Just the defining that balance is knowing that, like, it's tough. Any job where you have cash on hand is a difficult job. That's why serving has always been tough for people. Is you see a lot of servers, and they'll make $200 or $300 a night and drive the crappiest car because they make $200 or $300 a night and they spend $200 or $300 a night. Just like the whole stripper syndrome. They always know the money's coming somewhere, so they spend what they have. So you really have to figure out how to do that. Like, I don't know if you got to the part where I talk about merch. A lot of comics, they'll let's say buy T-shirts, get the T-shirt money, and then they spend it, and then they don't have money to buy more T-shirts. Like they don't understand that you you have to save that money first in order to get the new ones, in order to get the money that you need in the first place. So it's a lot of thinking ahead. It's a lot of basically planning weeks in advance. You have to like what I would try to do is when I was first starting out is I would try to pay all my bills as quickly as I could, so I wasn't struggling at the end of the month to pay them, and then start saving up some more money in whatever I need after that. If I need an oil change or something like that, and then start saving for the next month as well, because again, sometimes just one show cancellation could be enough to not be able to let you pay rent that month, and that's tough. That's a tough way to live.
Oh yeah. And speaking of that, what is it like traveling across the country? And I'm sure that does a lot of wear and tear on your car, like like you were talking about oil changes. As you're thinking about all that, are you able to kind of plan for that? Do you, if you're driving across the country, do you stop every little bit to get your oil changed and make sure that everything's good on your car? Or has that ever bitten you in the butt?
Yeah, well, it's tough. So when I first started doing comedy and I didn't have a lot of money, what I would buy crappy cars, and I would know I'd buy crappy cars, and I'd run them into the ground. I'd buy a car for $500 and drive it wherever it was and start saving up for the next car as quickly as I could. And that's not the best way to live, but you don't want to buy a brand new car, because you buy a brand new car for $25,000, let's say, and that's like a lower end car, and then 150,000 miles after that you have to buy a new car. Well, that's 2 years later when you're driving as much as I do, and you can't buy it if you have an extra $25,000 every 2 years. You're doing pretty darn good in your life, because most people don't, right? Have just a spare $25,000. But as I got older, I figured out there's little things. You can buy like a good used Honda, good used Toyota, something like that. And Toyotas and Hondas will run for 300, 400,000 miles if you take care of them. So that's what I do now is I'll buy a good Honda. I love Hondas. I don't know why. They're just my go-to car. Drive them, and I think I've had my last four cars have been Hondas, and there's not a single one that I didn't drive at least 330, 340,000 miles before I traded it in for another one, because when I traded it in, it was in perfect working condition. It's not like the car, had died on me. There's one that what literally I told you the Minot thing, where it actually conked out outside of Minot. I had to get a new transmission, and they didn't have transmissions in for my car in Minot. So they
And
said it'd be like 4 days, and I didn't have 4 days. So I sold that dealership, whatever, my car, and bought a new car and continued on my way from there.
wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's crazy. It sounds like there's times that you got to make big compromises like that to be able to keep following your passions.
Compromises, sacrifices. I call it sacrifices because it's one of those weird things where especially as you get older, all your friends, every friend that you know or new is gonna drift away, because all your current friends are gonna be comedian friends, because those are the people that you see and those are the people that are available. You're out doing shows on the weekends when your friends are out, hey, let's go to this concert, or hey, let's go to this cookout, or hey, let's go to this whatever. And you're like, I can't, I got a show. I'm in Indiana, I'm in Arkansas, I'm in Florida this week. And all of a sudden you stop getting invites. And then you go, hey, let's get together on a Monday. Let's get together on a Wednesday. And they're like, yeah, no, I have a job. I have kids. I have a life. And so you are going to make a lot of sacrifices, and you're not going to make a lot of money. And that's what your family's going to feel. They're going to see you. They're going to come out and support you sometime. And inevitably, the one show that they go to is going to be the worst show that possibly be. It's going to be some biker bar in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be 7 people in the audience that hate you, and they're going to they're going to say, like, what are you doing? What are you doing with your life? And you're going to try to explain to them that this isn't every day. This isn't the normal. And they're not going to believe it, because they only believe what they see. It's tough.
Oh yeah. Speaking of the biker bars, you talk about different kinds of crowds a lot in your book. Was it tricky to learn how to accommodate your show for bikers versus a corporate show versus a comedy club with teenagers or 20-year-olds,
Yes, yes. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do in comedy, is be able to create a show that is not only diverse enough that it'll fit almost any audience, but that you can switch up when necessary. Because sometimes you'll go into a gig and you'll look at the audience and you'll go, well, these guys aren't going to like this material. And then you'll be completely wrong. and whatever route you're starting, you're going to find out isn't working at all. You need to switch gears, go to a different direction, and suddenly hook them and go on your way. It's really tough to figure that out. And I think that the years of being on the road is what really worked for me, because when you're on the road, that's exactly what's going to happen. Like if you stay in one town, you might have 3 or 4 clubs within driving distance, and you figure out how to work those clubs, because those are the places that you're going to be at. You have the same type of audiences. You're going to get college students or people that are between the ages of 20 and 40 of the same basic socioeconomic demographic, whatever it is. And you're going to figure out the stuff that connects to those people. But then when you're on the road, you might have a show at a Holiday Inn one day, a show at a biker bar the next day, and 3 days after that, you're doing an Elks Lodge for somebody's 70-year-old birthday party. And you got to come up with material that's going to work for all those people. And that's why figuring out the subject matters, figuring out the things that everybody can relate to is kind of the key. And then being able to develop crowd work enough to connect to people, because that's also a thing. If you start talking to people in your audience, you can find out what connects to them. Like let's say you're doing a show and there's a guy in the front row wearing a cowboy hat, and you talk to him and you go, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, you're a rancher. I saw the hat. I had an idea. I didn't think it was costume day or whatever. You start going into that, and then you start developing a connection, and then the audience starts to gets endeared to you because you're talking, with them and not to them. And that's kind of the key to comedy too, is when you develop an act. Like there's some comedians who are just set up, punch, set up, punch, set up, punch, and that's all they do, right? And they're going to do really well in a lot of circumstances, and they're not going to do well in other circumstances. So you have to have a lot of tools in your tool belt, is what I always say, in order to make it work. Like if you're going to be a squeaky clean comic, you've got 2 options: limit the shows you're going to do and not take certain gigs, or you're going to take a lot of lumps when you're going along the way. Same thing if you're like a really dirty comic. You're a really dirty comic and you're playing an Elks Lodge, and they go, well, we have a church group in here tonight, and just do your normal show. And you're like, well, I can't do my normal show. It's a church group. Like I did an after prom once, and this is an example. When they hired me, they said, just do just a normal comedy show. And you're like, okay, great. So I get there and I reiterate, I go, so just a normal comedy show. And they go, yeah, just no cursing, no talking about drinking or drugs or sex, just anything.
Wow.
And don't touch on politics, and don't talk about religion. And you're like going, oh, so not a normal show is what you mean. You mean anything but a normal show, and somehow make that material relate to 17 and 18-year-old kids who have no life experience. Sure, that's an easy task. Let's do that right after prom, right after these people just got horned up by dancing with their partners, and all they want to do is leave and get drunk and fornicate, and they can't do that because they have to listen to this comic make them laugh, or try to make them laugh at 2:00 in the morning. These are all real shows. Like I don't use any examples that aren't real, right? I'm never gonna give somebody advice and say, what about this fanciful scenario? I'm gonna tell you stuff that has happened to me, and I talk about that in the book. These are real legit things that have happened, and these are real legit things that could happen to you.
Have you ever had a situation like that where like half the crowd likes a joke and the other half doesn't? And how do you deal with that? It seems like it brings back the compromises or sacrifices, and also thinking on your toes, especially when they bring rules into it last minute like that.
Yeah, for sure. That happens a lot. I think that's very common for comedy. I think people have a false sense that you're going to tell a joke that everybody's going to like. You're almost never going to have a joke that everybody's going to like. If you can get 8 out of 10 people, you're doing amazing. There are going to be some shows that you're going to do, and there's going to be 4 or 5 people that don't like a single joke that you tell. Or there's going to be certain people that are just going to look at you and not like your look. They don't like your t-shirt. They don't like, you remind them of an ex-boyfriend, or they don't like the tone of your voice, or who knows, they saw you pull up in the parking lot and they thought you had a snotty look on your face. They don't know. You don't know what the reason is. And that's the toughest part about comedy too, is that, and I explain that to people, is that a lot of times you got to worry on your first impression, right? You walk in smelling like pot, and there's a bunch of people in the audience that are against drugs. They're going to immediately be turned off by you. So you got to find a way to connect to those people, whatever that is. So you don't expect to get every joke with every person, but what I like to do is I find pivot points in the audience, and I'll find somebody in the front row, somebody in the middle section, somebody toward the back, and those are people that I look at directly when I'm doing my show. And then if I see somebody that looks like they're not as interested in my show, then I'll start a conversation with them. I'll engage with that person personally and try to figure out, are you married? Do you have kids? What do you do for a living? Do you live around here? What do you drive? Whatever, there's a million things that you can say. And one of the things that people also don't understand about crowd work is crowd work. You don't have to be funny with crowd work. It helps if you can, and it's kind of like fishing for something that's going to be funny. But really, it's just about getting them engaged to what you're talking about, and use that crowd work to pivot back into the material that you're talking about, right? Like, so, like, you could go up to somebody and say, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" "Oh, you're an accountant." And you're like, "Yeah, I've had a lot of weird jobs." And then you go into your job stuff. But if you have a big bit on accounting, then you can go into your accounting bit. Like, if I talk to somebody and I find out that they're a dental hygienist, I go, "Oh, the last time I went to the dentist." And then you go into your dentist bit. And then the audience thinks that what you're doing was completely off the top of your head, that it was completely spontaneous. And then they immediately have this respect for you that they didn't have before, because they thought you went in there with a completely scripted act. But the reality of it is, good comedy always seems spontaneous. And if it doesn't seem spontaneous, you're either a character, like Mitch Hedberg, which is great, and I love Mitch. I love him to death. Is Stephen Wright. I love Stephen Wright, but they're not going to connect like some other people are going to do, like a Nate Bargatze or Dave Chappelle or Dave Attell. These comedians that can, go into completely different types of material at the drop of a hat, because they've been doing it for so long.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a couple comics there. Who's your biggest influence, and who was your biggest influences when you got started, and how has that evolved?
That's a really good question, because right now my favorite comedian is Bill Burr, and I've loved Bill Burr for quite some time. My little brother actually got me into Bill Burr for the first time. I was at his visiting him, and he had one of his first specials taped, and I'd never even heard of him at that time. And I was like kind of annoyed that my little brother has another comedian saved on a DVD. And he doesn't have me. Like what are you talking? Your brother's with a comedian, and you have a different one. But Bill Burr, he blew me away. He blew me away with just his fearlessness and his approach to things, and he just attacked the stage, which I thought was really great, and I really did like that. When I first started doing comedy, I liked all comedians. To me, it was just comedy. It was really hard for me to even pinpoint one that I really liked. Obviously, there were certain ones when I was a kid that I could get more access to, like Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor and George Carlin and people like that, and Andrew Dice Clay and Sam Kinison. I think Sam Kinison might be the first one that really kind of blew my mind and told me that that's somebody I kind of want to be like. Not in the sense that I was going to be his style, but just in the sense that this is a different type of person. At that point in time, you got to remember, we're talking way back in the 80s and 90s. I first started doing comedy in 1990 or 91, and the standard person was blue jeans and a sports coat and tennis shoes, the Jerry Seinfeld type. And that was what most comedians were. And it was observational humor. It was, have you ever noticed this? Have you ever noticed that? And then Sam Kinison comes out and starts screaming and going, "I was married for 7 years, and why don't you move to where the food is?" And these kind of things, very aggressive. And I went, wow, that's different. I want to be different. I want to be something like that. And I was never like that, but I just wanted, it's one of those things to see somebody. But then Brian Regan was another one. The very first Brian Regan Live, which you can get on CD, blew my mind that he was that good. And afterwards, I'm like, and squeaky clean. Like, I didn't even realize at the time he was squeaky clean, because it was so funny that it superseded clean versus dirty or stuff like that. So I really respected that. That's a guy that visually, Brian Regan is amazing. But when you're just listening to his words, just his inflection, just his pauses, his way of of saying things, all the things that you can learn and all the things that you can just go, wow, it's just amazing. So if you're looking at my influences, currently Bill Burr, Brian Regan still is a guy. I love Nate Bargatze. Currently, he's also very clean and very personal, and somebody I think that a lot of people can relate to, really connect to, and I think he's great.
Cool. Yeah, they're all great. You said in your book that there was an audition that you did, and you had said "fuck" during it, and so the person, without even telling you that was a rule, didn't give you the job because you said that. Was that the only time something like that happened? And has an audience ever turned against you for either swearing or having dirty or like offensive material or anything? I've heard of audiences turning on comics before. I know you've gotten assaulted multiple times, so at least individuals in the audience have. But
Yes. So as far as to my knowledge, that was the only time that I didn't get a job because I said fucking an audition. That was the only time, and because after that, I kind of learned that lesson, and I stopped, saying fucking an audition. So I just said I'm just gonna do whatever I can do.
well, if I can interrupt real quick,
Yeah.
I guess at least how I read it in the book, it came across as more learn how the audition works, like what that person's looking for. Would you say it's more that, or more don't say fucking an audition in general?
Well, see, now that's a really good question because I would say it's both, right? If you can not say fucking an audition, you should probably not say fucking an audition, just to be on the safe side, right? Because you just don't know, you just never know. But it is also definitely figuring out what the parameters are going to be for that venue, right? Always know, always ask the right questions, always find it out. I think I talked about this in the book too, is that like there's an example where I hired a comic and I said, the only parameter is you can't say fuck. Well, he didn't say fuck, but he said the C word 4 times. And I'm like, okay. I shouldn't have to explain that there are other words you should never say. You should never say, right? And never say. And there are some comics that get away with saying the C word on stage. They have. I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a good thing to do because at most venues, they're going to frown upon it. And even if the most of the audience is okay with it, there's going to be 1 or 2 people who aren't. And those 1 or 2 people are going to be the most vocal people, and they're the ones that are going to complain and tell the management. And that's one of the things I tell people all the time. You could have 100 people that loved your show, or 98 of the 100 people loved your show. 2 of them didn't, and you might not get booked back because those 98 people who had a good time, they're not going to tell the management how much of a great time they had. It's the 2 people that didn't have a good time that are going to be expressive about it. That's kind of a thing. But the thing to also understand about comedy, and because to go back to your original question, is that you're not going to win every time. You're not going to. You're not going to win over every audience. There's going to be times where there are going to be a million circumstances that are against you, or you could just have a bad day. People have bad days. People have bad days in every job, right? And sometimes you're going to go up on stage and you're not going to feel the best, and your material's not going to connect, and it's just going to happen. And you have to accept that. Even to this day, 30 some years into it, I have bad shows. I did a show last summer, and it was an outdoor venue under a circus tent type place. It was a really nice kind of like a resort area. For the most part, the show was going great. I was the headliner. I was closing out the show. There were 3 comedians before me. They all did fine, but as the night got, the audience started drinking a lot, and by the time I'm up there, they're way more drunk than they used to be, and they're getting a little belligerent, and I had to do a lot more crowd work and go into them, kept them into the show. But you could see them, starting to fade out, having conversations, and they had a long show, and they're getting tired. And but then I go into my closing bit, and I have to take responsibility for it. I don't know, like it's an edgier bit, and that's why I save it for toward the end. It's an edgier bit, and either I said something wrong, or they took something wrong, or something had happened in that town that they related to in a very negative way, and lost them in my last bit, and they hated me at the very last, and there was no getting them back at the end of that. Most of the show was great, and then the ending just tanked. And sometimes you just got to take those lumps. And I walked off the stage and I said thanks, and when people left, they some of them wouldn't make eye contact, and it's hurtful. Like, you had 57 minutes of them loving you, and in 3 minutes that they hated you, and that's enough to turn the tides completely. And it's going to happen sometimes. There's no way to avoid it. You just have to accept that not all every show is going to be your show. Not every audience is going to be your audience. But as long as you do your best at every time, that's all you can hope for.
That's good advice. So if we can move into your writing, we keep mentioning your book that's called How to Fail at Stand Up. You can get that on your website, or I think it's on Amazon.
Yeah, How to Fail at Stand-Up Comedy. It's on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle or in paperback. If you go to my website, you can get an autographed copy in paperback, not in Kindle. I can't autograph Kindles. But yeah, that was my second book. I have 3 books out right now, and I'm still writing. But that's the only one that's not fiction. The other 2 are both thrillers.
Yeah. So how did you, obviously, I know how you got into the stand-up one, but in the fiction, how did that come about, and what has that taught you?
Yeah. So I had an idea for a novel for about 10 years. And I think everybody, not everybody, but most people have a book in them. They have an idea for a book, something they go, oh, I should write a book and about this, about my life, or about this experience, or some fictional thing. So I just had an idea for a book. I just never had time to write it. I've always been on the road. I've been constantly working. And when you travel as much as I do, and that's one of the things you have to understand, is that I might be gone for 3 or 4 days out of the week, but then the next day is a travel day. So that becomes 4 or 5 days out of the week, is because you're spending that whole day getting home. So then you only have 1 or 2 days free in a week, and they're not even free, because in those 1 or 2 days, you're doing your laundry, you're cleaning your house, you're trying to book new shows, you're sending out promotional materials, you're doing all kinds of different things. So you're kind of swamped with time. You don't have time to sit down on the computer and just start, writing a book. But then all of a sudden COVID hit, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere. So I said, you know what, this is a perfect time for me to just to start that book I was talking about. And I didn't know if I'd ever finish it. I didn't know if it was going to be just a temporary thing, but I needed something to do, because for somebody who's always on the road, always traveling, being home was like torture. Not doing anything was torture. So I
And
said,
always writing stand-up.
yeah, but stand up is a different thing. Stand up is when you write stand up. One of the things that people don't understand, the big difference, is that stand up is about conservation of words. It's about getting the maximum impact off the shortest amount of words. Right? Can I make this joke funnier by eliminating 2 or 3 words and stuff like that? With a book, you have to draw people in, and that takes a lot of words, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a different element to it. But I sat down every day and I started writing and writing and writing, and I said, I'm gonna write until the pandemic's over, or I have a book. Well, I wrote a first draft, and then I went back and I wrote a second draft, and I wrote a third draft, and then I think somewhere around the third draft is when I started doing the comedy book, the How to Fail at Stand-Up Comedy book, and then I went back and did a 4th draft and a 5th draft, and I said, you know what, this is pretty good. And one of the things that I had to come to a realization about is that my book isn't perfect. Of course not. None of my books are perfect. And I'm somewhat of a perfectionist, so it's hard for me to deal with the fact that it's not perfect. And it's going to be parts that I just don't like as much as others. But then I go, have I read books that are worse than this book? For sure. Have I read books that are better than this book? For sure. But I'm not trying to write War and Peace. I'm not trying to write Pride and Prejudice. Those aren't the types of books I want to read anyway. I try to write a book that I would want to read. So my first book, the plot was about a stand-up comedian, because there's not a lot of books where the main character is a stand-up comedian. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to have the stand-up comedian who goes on the road. He's a road comic. He hooks up with some girl and he catches a disease and almost starts a pandemic, just like the pandemic that we're all living in right now, of a different sort. But I just thought that's kind of a cool way to look into it, because the idea of the book was, if you needed to track down a comic and you didn't know who he was, how are you going to do that? Because they're always gone. They're always somewhere. And you don't, some comics have a website to show all their shows, and some comics don't. And like, if a comic was in Arkansas one day and he's in New Jersey the next day, how do you know that? And how do you find that person if their schedule isn't posted, and that kind of thing? So it's just kind of a fun way, I thought, to explore if something bad was to happen in a to a stand-up comedian, or something, messed up was going to happen in stand-up comedian. Like if you look at most thrillers that you see, right? There's always something happens to some random person wherever, and then this hero comes and he has to save the day and stuff like that. But what if that something random happens to a comedian? And that's kind of, where that book took off from, I guess. I'm not trying to give away the whole plot of the book, so
Definitely.
it's kind of hard to talk around it without explaining that. But
Yeah, I guess basically you answered the first part, but I'm curious what that has taught you. Like, has
oh,
that impacted your how you do stand up at all, or has it? You've written other books since then, so has that experience
well,
taught you anything?
I've learned a lot. It's one of those things, just like stand up, right? The more you do stand up, the better you're going to get, and the more you write, the better you're going to get. And what I learned is that there are so many more creative outlets out there than I really thought of, and so many different things that you can do. And I don't get the exact same type of thrill from writing that I do from stand up, because stand up gives you that immediate gratification of walking up on stage. You write a joke, and in 2 minutes whether that joke works or doesn't. You can write a book, and it could be 2 years before you find out if that book's any good or not. And so it's a whole different animal. But I learned that I don't know else to explain it, other than the fact that, has it helped my stand up? um it's like a different avenue. You know what I mean? It's like a completely different type of thing. Like if you swim, does it help you run? Yeah, because you're still building the muscles. You're building the writing muscles. You're building the ability to work your mind in different areas and to cover different subject areas. And it also opened up my eyes to more memories and things of my life that I try to put into my books, and realize, oh, I can write a joke about that, or that's something that happened in my life that I can actually I never talked about this ever on stage, and those parts of things. So I think I love writing. But somebody asked me the other day, if I could choose stand up or writing, which would I choose? And I'm still going to choose stand up every day of my life, because that's my passion. That's who I am. But writing is something that I love to do, but it's not the same thing as stand up. It just never will be.
Definitely. So getting back to your stand up, what's your take on parallel thinking and jokes that have you been impacted by that? Either you borrowing a concept that or doing a joke on a concept that somebody has done in the past, or vice versa, somebody doing something that you've done.
Yeah, for sure. It's impossible to not. If you're doing stand up, especially at the beginning of your career, you're going to do a joke about something that somebody else has already done. And it's impossible to be an encyclopedia of comedy. It's impossible to know what every comic is doing everywhere across the country. And there's also the possibility that you heard that comic tell that joke 5, 6, 8 years ago, or something similar to that joke, and you stored it in your back of your mind and forgot completely that somebody else had done that joke. That stuff happens too. So it becomes tough. There are some comedians that won't listen to other comedians because they don't want to be influenced by that person for that reason. But for me personally, what I like to do is I try to write as personally as I possibly can. So if I write about events that actually happened to me, it's going to be kind of hard for another person, to write a similar joke, because that experience did not happen to them. But when you're writing things like back in the day, there's a million jokes about O.J. Simpson, or a million jokes about John Wayne Bobbitt, getting his penis cut off. There's only so many directions you can go with that particular joke. So you're going to write similar jokes. When that movie Indecent Proposal came out, where he said, would you have sex with my wife for $1 million? Well, all of a sudden, there's 100 comics that do jokes about what they would do for $1 million. That's just going to happen, because that was the pop culture zeitgeist at the time. And so people are gonna, it's gonna pop in their heads. Well, what would I do for $1 million? It's a simple concept, right? So what I try to do is try to write jokes that aren't that simple. It's happened to me recently, where I wrote a joke, and it was a play on AAA versus AA, right? As far as AA is Alcoholics Anonymous, and AAA is the Auto Club, right? And I did a joke about that, and then I watched a Netflix special, and there's a comedian that did a completely different joke, but about that exact same subject, about AAA and AA. So I'm like, well, crap. I guess I'm just not going to do that joke anymore. One of the things I do is I write all the time. I'm constantly writing new jokes. So I have no problem throwing away or ditching a joke if another comedian starts doing something similar. That's why I always figure if you're writing something that other comics are also doing, maybe it's time to try to write a little bit more originally. And some comedians are going to steal your material. It's going to happen. There are some scumbags out there. They're going to find your great joke and they're going to take it. But I figure if you write jokes that are personal to you, they kind of can't take them. Like I wrote a joke on one of my, not my last CD, but the CD before that, where I started talking about Thanksgiving dinner, and my mom, she kept calling the turkey a tom turkey, and I asked the question: are turkeys that we eat males or females? And all of a sudden, I went down a rabbit hole and did some research and found out about that. Well, I don't think there's a lot of comics doing jokes about turkeys, you know,
Yeah.
a ton. So I always joke about, I write jokes that people don't steal because nobody wants to steal my jokes. You know, if you write them, if they're weird enough, if they're strange enough, people won't try to take them. But it's going to happen inevitably. Years ago, I wrote a joke. I'd lost weight because I had food poisoning, so I wrote about that. Wrote a joke about losing weight because of food poisoning. It's the new weight loss trend. Just eat bad food and you can lose 20 pounds. And then Nick DiPaolo had a special, and he said, "I just lost 20 pounds on this controversial new diet called the flu." And I'm like, "Shit!" I just wrote almost that same joke, but about food poisoning. But then I thought about it, and I went, "Well, I mean, is it that hard to get to that material? Is it that hard to get to that premise? It's not." So I just threw that joke away and started writing a new one.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just a couple more questions. You said in the book that you had told Larry the Cable Guy that you weren't sure about the Cable Guy part of his act before he was doing that as his full act.
Yeah.
So that made me wonder, what's like the proudest moment you've had and the least proud moment you've had in your career? Because if he had listened, then his career would be drastically different, for better or worse.
Right.
But I'm just,
Yeah. So that's tough. When you say the proudest moment as far as something I've accomplished or something I've done, there's so many ups and so many downs in this career. It's really hard to pinpoint that. But like when I talked about the Larry the Cable Guy thing, the point I was making in that was that nobody knows anything. Somebody can give you the best advice in the world, and it might not be the best advice in the world for you. Everything is different. You just don't know. So I really liked Dan Whitney's show when he was just Dan Whitney, and I thought he was hilarious. And I personally didn't like the dumb redneck cable guy thing, and the audience loved it. And that's the whole thing, was the audience absolutely loved it, and people came out to the show for that bit because he was a radio personality at that point in time, and that's what he was known for, these radio call-in things as Larry the Cable Guy. And I was just like, man, you're so much better than that. Like, why are you doing that? And it just goes to show that I don't necessarily know anything, or I could give somebody advice and it could be the one thing that they needed to understand. It's tough. That's why I wrote a book. And one of the first things, if you read the book, I told you, I said, take what works for you and throw away what doesn't, because it's not all going to be advice that's going to work for you. So
yeah, definitely. I think though too, if he had not stuck with the Cable Guy act, from the sounds of it, he could have still been very successful. And that's kind of where I'm getting at with the question, because it seems like there's branching paths, and no matter which way you go, you could have a lot of success and a lot of proud moments and not proud moments. So
yeah, and I think that there are some comedians are just very talented, and it doesn't matter what they do; they're going to be successful. And I'll give an example. I'm not gonna say his name, but there's a comedian that when he was open micing, I really thought he was incredibly funny. I thought he was a really funny guy that was kind of insecure, but he wrote really good jokes. And I tried to give him opportunities. I'd say, come out and do 5 minutes in front of me, or come out here and I'll travel with me, and I'll put you up here and I'll give you these shows and stuff like that. And that guy won a comedy contest and ended up getting an agent, and that worked out into getting him, a couple appearances on Conan O'Brien and stuff like that. And it wasn't like, his career is still young. He could go on to other great things. But I felt really good that I noticed his talent very early on and knew that he was definitely somebody that that had it. Now there's another guy that I knew that was a very funny comic, great comic. I thought he was great. He traveled with me. We did a lot of shows, and then he decided that comedy wasn't for him. And I put a lot of work into that guy and tried to give him as much help as I could. And then he decided that he didn't want to be a comedian in the end. And that was like I felt in a lot of ways like kind of deflated, you know, not that I wasted my time with him, but I just thought he had so much potential. But then I realized he's one of those guys who's got a lot of potential with a lot of things in life. So comedy's just one of his branches, just one of his things. And I shouldn't be mad at a guy because he had his time with it. He did what he could, and then he decided he wanted to go a different route, and I'm happy for him. So you know, you're right. There are some people out there that have, you know, this massive talent and massive abilities to do everything. And there's going to be people that you're going to see and you're going to think are terrible. And then you're going to see them on the Tonight Show in 5 years. And you're going to be like, what the fuck happened? How? You know? And I think the hardest thing that's going to happen is that you're going to do shows. And this has happened to me 20 times where you had an opening act that was terrible. Like you're headlining a show, the opening act goes up, the audience hates him, they dug a hole for you, you didn't do well, and then a few years later, they've got the TV spot, and you don't have a TV spot yet, and you're like going, how did that guy who couldn't hold his own in Omaha, Nebraska, all of a sudden, you know, he's killing on the Late Show. This guy's got a Netflix special. Like, how is this possible? And you just have to accept that it's not always about talent, and it's not just about talent. It's who you know, it's how hard you work, it's being in the right place at the right time, and being the demographic that is in at that moment, you know. And you know, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been getting into stand up since the first week of January. Just they started doing a open mic nearby.
Uh-huh.
So that's the other reason that I was really interested in speaking with you today. And it's been really interesting getting started in the open mic world. It's much different than what you see on the Netflix specials and stuff.
For sure.
And there's a lot of stuff in your book, and throughout this interview you've said a lot of things that's great advice. But if you could go back to when you were first starting, and if you only had like 2 or 3 minutes to talk to yourself at your first open mic, what would the advice you would give to yourself be?
Wow.
Essentially the advice you would give to anyone who's looking to get started today.
Right.
And you know, I'm sure your answer is going to be a little different because you started in a much different place in comedy. So I guess if you want to give a separate answer for somebody who is starting today versus what you would give advice to yourself on your first open mic, you can do that. But
Yeah, so this is really tough, and it's tough for a lot of reasons because that's that whole age-old thing. If you go back and talk to your younger self, how would you do that, right? What would you tell them? What I would say is, man, that's so tough. Is that is okay. The best advice I'm going to give somebody is going to be to that you're not gonna be great every time, and to be honest with yourself, and to constantly be writing, always be rewriting, you know, your material, and understand though the jokes you write is only a portion of what it is to be a stand-up. You have to, you know, perform the jokes as well, and you have to have confidence in all these different types of things. But I would tell people that being a professional is more important than being funny. Following the rules, dressing nice, shaking hands, meeting the right people is always the better plan. You know, be funny as much as you can, but the offstage is just as important, if not more important. I would tell myself um, to stay humble, obviously, and to not get drunk and not be stupid. Because I've, you know, if you got that far in the book, you know, I spent a lot of times drinking and doing dumb things because I was drinking and thinking that, you know, I'm on the road in the middle of nowhere in some stupid small town, and it's not going to end up biting me in the ass. But it's a small world, comedy world, and I'd also say to to network as much as you possibly can. But the most important thing is, for me, and this is just for me, is take the opportunities that are given to you. Just take them, even if you don't think you're ready. Take those opportunities and stretch and do that, because I think I missed out on a lot of things because I was afraid. I was afraid I wasn't ready. I was afraid I couldn't handle it. I was afraid it wasn't the right crowd for me. And to not live in fear is to just take those opportunities and run with them. If somebody's offering it to you, there's a reason, and take that opportunity, because you don't want to miss out. You don't want to sit home 10 years later and go, what if I had done this? What if I had gone to that audition? What if I had talked to that one person? What if I had followed up with this other person? Because you just don't know.
My last question then is, it's something that I like to ask everybody that I talk to. I used to run a organization that was promoting anti-bullying, and trying to help the kids who deal with that in my area. I was wondering, have you ever been bullied, and how has that impacted you? And then what advice would you give to any kids who deal with that? I know a lot of comedians have dealt with that, and kind of helps shape them into the comedian that they become.
Yeah, I do think that's true. I think that for a lot of comedians, is bullying was one of the things that made them become a comedian. I think that when you're a kid, and you're not the biggest kid, and you're not the strongest guy, and you're not the most athletic or whatever, that you're going to be in a situation where some alpha male is, who's just as insecure as you, but just shows it in a different way, is going to try to come out and push you around in varying ways, whether it's physical or mental, or or whatever it is, trying to embarrassing you in class, and those type of things, and it's going to happen. So the only thing that the best advice I would give to somebody in that situation is this, is that believe in yourself and don't listen to what other people say. If they are trying to bully you for whatever reason, it's because they're insecure and they're intimidated by you in some capacity. And I know it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't seem like that. The captain of the football team is pushing you into a locker. It's because you're smarter than him, and that bothers him because he knows that he's never going to be as smart as you, and he's never going to be able to make the type of decisions that you make. He's never going to be able to get the good grades and that type of thing. And that guy's insecure. So understand that everybody's insecure. Everybody has their issues, and just be, just believe in yourself, and don't let it sink in. Don't let it get to you, because you're better than that. You are, and people that are good people aren't going to treat you that way. So you don't need to care what that person thinks anyway. Connect to the people that connect to you, and use them as your support group, because in the end, when you think about high school, or you think about things like that, most people, when they're an adult, they don't hang out with their friends from high school anyway. That high school is just a blip on your radar, and you can be whoever you want to be uh, further on in life, and use your assets, do what you can. And if there's something that you want to better about yourself, do that, but do it for you. Don't do it because somebody else tried to bully you into being that way, because don't do something that you don't want to do to make somebody else happy. Be true to yourself.
Incredible. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. It's been great talking to you. You're very funny. I hope that you do try and write Pride and Prejudice, because I'm sure you'd make it much more entertaining than the first time I read it. But yeah, I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to, I would like to see you live hopefully soon. And yeah, I think anyone who's interested in getting into comedy should check out your book, and I'm gonna finish reading it so that I can continue on my stand-up career. And I appreciate all of the wisdom that you've given today.
Oh, I appreciate that too. Keep in touch, man. Let me know what you think when you get to the end of it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, I hope you have a good day, and yeah, definitely keep in touch.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
All right. Thanks.